on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 325 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about X-Men 92, Volume 0, Warzones. This is the first 4 issues of an ongoing series that spun out of the events of Secret Wars. The premise here is that we have a version of the X-Men that is a throwback to the animated series and the status quo of the comics from right around the time when the animated series started. These guys are hailed as heroes in the Westchester region of Battleworld. If you'll recall, in Secret Wars, we had a whole bunch of different alternate realities that were all smashed together into one giant world that was cobbled together with many different pieces of alternate worlds. And this particular region of Battleworld is supposed to basically resemble the X-Men comics of the early 90s and kind of sort of represent the X-Men the animated series. And at this point in time, the X-Men are hailed as heroes. They are not hated and feared like they usually are. And they discover a plot by Cassandra Nova, who has a very different origin in this book than she does in the main Marvel 616 universe, and she has very different motivations than she usually does in the comics where she's a villain. And she is trying to basically insert herself as the new Baron of this region, which is kind of similar to what Baron Mordo was doing in the MODOK Assassin miniseries, but her aims are very different than what Baron Mordo was doing. They're both basically trying to do the same thing, but through very different methods. And this book is fantastic. I absolutely love this book. This feels the most like what I feel like the X-Men should feel like out of every X-Men book that I've read for the last, 5 years. Pretty much since Avengers vs. X-Men, I have been pretty consistently disappointed with a lot of the X-Men stuff that I've read. That doesn't mean that everything has been bad, but I feel like a lot of the stuff that has come since Avengers vs. X-Men has kind of missed the point of what I feel like the X-Men should be. And this book harkens back to a time where a lot of the stories weren't necessarily good, but we still enjoyed the X-Men comics of that time and X-Men the animated series. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and clue you in on a little secret. I don't actually like X-Men the animated series. I don't think it's very good. It is something that got me into the X-Men whenever I was a little kid, but looking back on it as an adult, I think it's actually really awful, even though everyone else in the world really loves that series and worships the ground that it walks on. Having said that, I really like this book because it harkens back to my nostalgia about X-Men the animated series. Not exactly, because there's stuff here that I'm 99% sure wasn't in X-Men the animated series. For example, there is an X-Force team here, and I'm pretty sure X-Force never showed up in the cartoon, or if they did, they didn't show up as a team. We got to see, maybe Cable show up in the cartoon, or maybe members of X-Force, but we didn't get to see the actual team show up in X-Men the animated series. Deadpool shows up here, and I'm almost certain that he never showed up in the cartoon. So there are elements in this book that weren't in the cartoon, but this is called X-Men 92, and I'm pretty sure that's the year that the cartoon premiered. So this is harkening back to people's love of the cartoon, but it's also using elements from the comics of that time period as well. And like I said, a lot of the comics from the 1990s, not just X-Men comics, but just in general, the 1990s was not a very good time for comic books. There weren't a whole lot of just really great comics of that time period. I feel like that's kind of when a lot of people look back to when they say, what was the worst time for comics? A lot of people look back at the 90s. There was a lot of just really awful stuff going on in the comics, and also just the industry as a whole was changing, and not necessarily for the better. But even though a lot of the X-Men stuff from this time period wasn't very good, I feel like it felt more like what the X-Men should feel like at its core than what a lot of the X-Men stuff coming out now feels like, or at least stuff that I've read. I actually am about a year behind on X-Men stuff, so I shouldn't say stuff that's coming out right now because I don't know. But a lot of the stuff that I have read much more recently feels like more of a departure from the X-Men than what this is harkening back to. And I think this does a really good job of capturing the spirit of what the X-Men should feel like, almost to a fault. If I had any complaint about this book at all, it's that this is only 4 issues long, but it feels a lot longer, and that's actually a good thing. I actually like that this feels like it's got more story in it than what it actually does. In 4 issues, you feel like you're getting 6 issues worth of story, and most of the time, I feel like I'm actually complaining about the opposite. Usually, if I get a 6 or 7 issue story, I'm complaining that there's really 4 issues worth of story in something that's that long. I'm usually complaining about decompression. This is the opposite. This is really compressed, and I like that they were able to fit as much story into such a small amount of space that they were able to do. But what a lot of people may not like is that there's so much shoved in here that it gets a little crowded. You've got your main X-Men team that's like Cyclops, Storm, Jean Grey, Jubilee, Rogue, Gambit, Beast, and Professor X. Professor X is kind of on the side, but he's part of the team technically. So that's already a pretty big cast of characters. But then these guys get in a little bit of a jam, and then you introduce other characters in this book, like X-Force. So that's Cable, Bishop, Deadpool, Psylocke, Archangel, and then you get even more characters like Chamber. You've got Artie and Leech. You've got Feral. You've got a whole bunch of stuff here, and then you've got the bad guy, Cassandra Nova. And I really like their origin for Cassandra Nova. I think that was really creative, really brilliant. They could have very easily just used the same origin that Grant Morrison went with, and nobody would have thought any differently of them. I like that they went with an entirely different origin while still connecting her to Professor X. I won't ruin what the surprise is there, but I kind of like that. I also like that there's more to this character than meets the eye. And I'm a little confused about the character herself because we find out that there is something guiding her actions in this book, but then we also find out that there is a persona to Cassandra Nova also, so that was a little confusing for me. But anyway, what I was saying was, I think that maybe some people, if you are not an avid reader of the X-Men like I am, if you haven't read just about everything from 1963 all the way up to, say, 1991, then you might be a little confused at some of the stuff here. For example, whenever you get to the last half of the book and you have Chamber, he is a prisoner of Cassandra Nova, and you've got all these other, how shall I say, ugly mutants that she doesn't think would make good mascots for her New World Order. They're all there, and at that point you might be thinking, this is a little bit much. It's a little hard to keep up with all of this stuff here. There's references to stuff that I really like, but if you aren't as big of an X-Men fan as I am, and I'm not trying to say like, oh, this is above your head. I'm not trying to say that. If you're not familiar with the 40-something years of X-Men comics that this is homaging, then it might be a little bit confusing. Or maybe not. There's references to stuff like how the X-Men are always playing baseball. Actually, I think they say basketball in the book, but the X-Men traditionally, they play baseball a lot more often than they play basketball. But there's references to that. There's references to around this time, Psylocke had a crush on Cyclops, and he kind of sort of had a thing for her, even though he was with Jean. That's referenced a little bit here. We also have a reference to the Onslaught saga that actually happened after 1992, but that kind of gets thrown in there too, and that was a little confusing. I feel like that didn't necessarily have to be there, but then you've got Senator Kelly, you've got references to Magneto, you've got references to Joseph, you've got a kind of a cameo appearance of Generation X at the end, and I really do love the way they kind of transition into a new status quo for the X-Men at the end of this book. But you've got a lot of references to a lot of stuff, even stuff that's not necessarily in the comics. If you've ever heard of the podcast Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men, formerly called Rachel and Miles Explain the X-Men, those two are actually in this book. They cameo here as apprentices or henchmen of Cassandra Nova, so that's something that's kind of neat. If you're a fan of people who talk about the X-Men on the internet, then there's a little Easter egg for you. There is a ton of stuff here. There's a reference to the X-Men arcade game that existed in real life. So there is a ton of stuff here that is referenced that you may or may not appreciate. If you're not a big X-Men fan, if you're just a casual fan, or if this is your very first X-Men story, a lot of this may seem a little confusing to you. I personally really loved it because I love the X-Men, and it feels like they took everything that's awesome about the X-Men and distilled it down into 4 issues. Like, if I had to go on a desert island and could not bring any other X-Men comic with me, I think I'd almost be tempted to say that I would bring this book with me because it has references to everything else that I love about the X-Men, and the story is pretty awesome also. I am super excited to read what else is going to be happening in this series. I think this series only lasted 3 trade paperbacks, which is very disappointing. I really wish that it could have gone a lot longer. This kind of reminds me of X-Men Forever, which was written by Chris Claremont, and I believe with art by Todd Knock, if I'm not mistaken. And that was a series that kind of had a similar premise, harkening back to the 1990s, right when Chris Claremont left the X-Men, but a lot of people really did not like that series. I didn't really care for what I read from it. I think this is a much better version of that same kind of attempt, where we're harkening back to a time that everyone is nostalgic for, but I think it works a little bit better here than it did in X-Men Forever. So anyway, I like this. It is managing to recapture a lot of what was old and awesome about the X-Men while also able able to do new stuff and go in a new direction. So I really like that. I think this is great for old fans of the X-Men, and I think it's pretty good for new fans of the X-Men too. But bear in mind, you may have to keep Wikipedia open and start looking stuff up as you read this book, maybe. Or maybe I'm just overestimating how dense this is with references that you may or may not understand. Maybe I'm completely off base. I don't know. So anyway, I love this book a lot. I hope that you guys like this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.